I'm going to start with the prepared questions and we'll get through as many as we can. First one came in, said interested in bullet point two, which is what the president can and cannot do on inauguration day or any other. Just as a recap there, I put on the executive orders. What can happen with those executive orders on day one? I want you to really pay attention though to the bottom, two bullets, especially cannot change laws. The president has a very, very narrow majority to change laws. Unfortunately, as we know, the Senate requires 60 votes anymore to get much accomplished. There are some things that they can do as long as they can get maybe 50 to 51 votes to come across in the Senate. It's a pretty tight window right now. We're going to be at around 52 for Republicans. So they cannot lose any people, any support. But first, they have to get it through the House, which is extremely tight right now. And the problem we have with the House is it's a 2-year election cycle. And what we've seen happen pretty much, I believe, every midterm election, we've seen at least one chamber of Congress flip. And what we've seen happening is the party affiliation comes down to independents have more votes than the other two parties. And that means if independents are not happy, at the next midterm election, they just vote for the other party. So the president really has 2 years to get things done, but he has such a narrow majority in the House of people who are running for reelection already that it's going to be tight to get much accomplished. So while there's a lot of things that our economy and our country needs to happen, they're going to have to be things that probably pull some Democrats over to his side to get them pushed through because he may not have all the Republicans supporting him. So I think that's important to understand, what can and cannot be done. Executive orders can change directives, can revoke other things. He cannot change the law with that. For that, he has to go to Congress, and for that, it's going to be a very interesting year as far as what's happening in Congress. I tend to not wait, not make any decisions about anything until it's voted and signed, because we're going to have a very interesting, what is this, 119th Congress session coming up. Going to be a lot of drama happening there in the Capitol. So next question. So I'd like to see a short and long-term tax overview from I believe it was Mr. Zellner. I wasn't quite sure what that was going. So Mr. Zellner, if you want to send us a message afterwards, maybe we can schedule some time to talk about it specifically. Or if you have an SEM advisor, reach out to them and we can talk about it in more details. But what I wanted to talk about is I I was having a hard time getting, charts, because this question just came in this morning, showing the long term. This chart at the bottom, I like it because it says average effective tax rate of the top 0.1% of US households. And, you know, even now we're still the income tax rate for the top 0.1% households are still 20 to 22%. And that's because a lot of their the top 0.1% households do not have income taxes. They have capital gains and they have other things, that have a much lower tax rate. But then when you factor in all other federal, state, and local, they're at 40%. Not saying we should or will go back there, but we had quite a bit of prosperity in the 50s with the top 0.1% paying half their money in taxes. You could see the problem though is we can't just keep taxing the top 1%. They're now paying, I think when this was last updated, like 48% of the total tax is paid by the top 1% of people. We're going to have to figure something out on taxes because the bottom 50% of Americans are barely covering any of the burden. I don't know, and we're obviously not going to solve it on this webinar, but long-term taxes have been higher. Short-term I think we'll probably get an extension of most of the tax cuts. Maybe we'll get a few other tax cuts, but longer term going forward, taxes have to come up, unfortunately. Um, and expenses have to be cut. So I, I don't know. It, it's not an easy answer, but I think in general, and this has been my point for 20 years, is 20 years from now, we're probably going to see taxes higher. If they're not great, then you just saved more money. But we should assume that tax rates are going to be higher, 20 years from now, just to pay for all the spending things, especially Social Security and Medicare, for that. So again, if that wasn't exactly what you were looking for, reach out to your advisor, let us know from there. Next prepared question. Actually, I combined this into one. Why are mortgage rates going up even though the Fed cuts rate? Will they ever stop? And then what would you expect to happen this year with high yield savings account return rates and the key factors? Again, they might sound different, but they are kind of the same. What I want to focus on is the 3-month, the short-term rate. That's what the Federal Reserve sets. And you can see when they panicked about inflation and they hiked rates, and now they've been cutting rates. That's what's happened to that red line there. The blue line is long-term interest rates. And so long-term interest rates, you can see they were worried about inflation way before the Fed was. The free market sets long-term interest rates. And you could see how they started increasing rates way back, in really beginning of into 2020, beginning of 2021, they were already increasing rates. Well, what you'll notice if you look at that closely is since the Fed started cutting rates, the free market has been raising rates. Your mortgage rates are long term, so they're based on what the free market is setting for long-term rates. So your mortgage rates for new mortgages or refinancing will not go back down until the free market, not the Federal Reserve, starts cutting rates. The free market will not cut rates if they believe a couple of things and sometimes a combination of things. Number one being that they believe inflation is going to resume back to normal. And we already talked about with tariffs and deportations and things like that. That could definitely be something that, could matter. It's something that we have to do. Hopefully we can get inflation to not be a problem, then they can cut rates. The other thing is when the economy is growing, that's by nature inflationary. And so you typically see rates going up. So unfortunately, if you want to see interest rates for your mortgages go down, then you have to see the economy slow down so that we don't have such high inflation. And then that's obviously bad for your housing prices and your jobs. So I'm I'm not one to forecast mortgages, but based on the trends now, I would not expect them going down anytime soon unless we see inflation rates not coming to fruition that are expected with tariffs and deportations. Now, the other question was on high yield savings accounts, and that gets to be a little bit harder because a high yield savings account is basically how much a bank needs to pay to get your money. And if interest rates are low, like we saw back here, banks weren't having to pay you very much, so you didn't see very attractive rates on high yield savings. But when the Fed started hiking rates and all of a sudden you could get 5.5% in a money market account, banks were like, oh, shoot, we need money. Everybody's not putting money in their bank. They're putting it in a money market account. And if people don't put money in a savings account at a bank, they don't have any money to lend to take advantage of these high rates. So banks had to start paying really high rates in these high yield savings accounts to do that. Well, now money market rates are down around 4.2 to 4.5, depending on which money market you're using. And so now those high yield savings accounts have come down a bit. If the Fed keeps cutting rates, you're going to see those high yield savings accounts decline even more. But if the Fed holds steady, the thing to watch will be what happens with these rates. So the days of 7, 8, 9% high yield savings accounts are probably over. If you have some, great. It's a pretty cool rate for a low risk investment. But it's going to be tied to what happens with this chart. If they both keep going lower, banks will have no incentive to do that. But if these start picking up once again, banks are going to be having competition. They say the sweet spot is around 5% for treasury rates. The 30-year yesterday was above 5%. It's dropped a little bit below today. So 5% is kind of the competition level psychologically for banks. So if you see treasuries on the 10-year get above 5%, you might see banks having to pay higher interest rates to attract that. So that's kind of where we're at on that. Next question. What lessons did we learn from the breakup of Ma Bell and earlier Microsoft antitrust cases? Um, I guess with Ma Bell, eventually they'll all come back together. They I kind of remember that. I lived in Colorado, so we became Mountain Bell instead of AT&T. I think Mountain Bell is now Quest if they're still around. Um, but I think for me personally, because I was an investor in Microsoft in the 90s, I think the lesson is, and I'm guessing what Brian's asking here is because we've seen the Department of Justice both, coming after Microsoft and Google and threatening breakups. Um, and it sounds like the Trump Justice Department is going to continue pursuing these things. So it's a warning shot towards Microsoft and Google. And then we've even seen both President Trump and Biden going after NVIDIA, not talking about breaking them up, but talking about their monopoly as well. I think the lesson is when the government starts interfering and threatening your business model, it can become dead money. And I didn't have time to pull a chart, but I did in our newsletter a couple weeks ago talk about Intel and Microsoft before and after they were added to the Dow, because ironically, Intel and Microsoft were added to the Dow, and a couple months later, the Department of Justice announced they were opening an antitrust case against Microsoft. So just when they became big enough to become part of the Dow and part of like American lore and legacy, the Department of Justice said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, you're too big." And by the way, it was a Republican doing that with George W. Bush. His Department of Justice was the one pursuing breaking up Microsoft. Intel is, I think they got hurt by it as well because Intel and Microsoft were in all the same products. You had this spunky little startup called AMD trying to take share from Intel, but Intel at one point had like 85% of the PC market um, there. What we learned is it can become dead money if you have the Department of Justice coming after you. Part of that was they had gotten so big that they were just cannibalizing themselves. Microsoft's customers were also some of their competitors, and it just became very hard for Microsoft to get much bigger. And I do think that's a problem for Google and Nvidia. And now once again, Microsoft, because Microsoft is being threatened by the Department of Justice when Microsoft is so much more diversified today than they were back then. Their web services, Azure is phenomenal. They've switched from putting software on the hard drives of computers to selling it as a service and a subscription. So I think the lesson is it can become dead money whenever the government starts trying to interfere and keep a company smaller. Longer term, though, when Ma Bell was broken up, it became a phenomenal source of value because you look at some of those companies as standalones today, and what they've brought as far as technology goes, it's pretty impressive. So typically, smaller is better anyway. So a smaller company can be more adaptive and more creative in what they do. So longer term, it could be big for the industry overall, just not so good for those stocks. So hopefully, Brian, that answered your question. Um, this one literally came in just before we went on the air. With Donald Trump's inauguration set for Monday, should I buy more of my current stocks, I recall correctly, last time his inauguration happened, stocks skyrocketed. Just looking for a little advice, and I won't hold you accountable. Thanks. Nicole, obviously none of this is advice. I I go back to say if your financial plan says you should have more equity, you should have more equity. So that means, did the president or his inauguration change your financial plan? And the answer is probably not. We don't know what laws or things are going to be implemented there. So that's it. We should not invest just because we think stocks are going to skyrocket. And yes, they did. But one thing that I keep reminding people about was 2018 was a very, very hard time for the stock market. And a lot of people cashed out before they were able to take advantage. And this chart, I show it pretty often in the blog. I was showing it in real time back in 2018 and 19. There's a key piece here is, I think stocks started down here. They did skyrocket. And then we got the Tax Cuts and Jobs passed, going, and stocks really skyrocketed at the start of 2018. So the beginning of year two of President Trump. The problem was then we start talking about tariffs, and we saw all sorts of ups and downs. This was almost a bear market, 19.5% drop, because he expanded tariffs to 25% effective January 2019. Then it ended up not happening. Spoiler alert. By the time he backed off, the tariffs came around, maybe 25% on a couple of things, but 10%-ish tariffs was the final number. And the range of things that we tariffed was very small compared to what he was talking about. And so then the stock market took off until just before COVID, it started, running into things. And of course, we know what happened after that. So I would not buy anything ahead of inauguration unless your financial plan said to. I would not sell anything ahead of inauguration unless your financial plan said to. I would just say stick to your plan because it's going to be a very wild ride. So that was all I had for prepared questions. It looks like, let me check the chat. We have just one actual question. Anonymous, thank you for saying you enjoy my talks. But the actual question, and last chance you have probably 60 seconds to get any more questions in, was from Cameron M. It says the legitimacy of Elon Musk having input as a policymaker aside, can you discuss the impact of GDP, government plus consumer plus investment plus net trade, of a $3 trillion reduction in government spending? Yeah, so let's see if I can get back to, where was that chart? There we go. Let me share my screen one more time. So that was here. So I think we need to be really careful. So we have a 30-ish trillion dollar economy. I forget the final numbers. So if they did do 3 trillion, that would be 10% of the economy being cut. Now they're down to 500 billion. That's one thing. But what they're, let me back up just slightly so we don't have that covering up. What Doge is talking about is cutting this red line here, which is government expenditures as a percentage of the economy. And so that was at the end of, I think, September last year, was 17% of our economy. And so they're not talking about cutting 3 trillion anymore. Now they're talking about cutting half a trillion, which is about 3% of GDP. So that's significant. And if it did happen all in one year, that would technically put us slightly in a recession. And I mentioned 1.5 million jobs is what they're talking about. That's that's a lot of jobs. That is, we did what, 250,000 jobs estimated last month. So we're talking about, what, 5 or 6 months of jobs being slashed, although those are pretty well-paying jobs. The question I would have then for Mr. Musk would be, do we give them unemployment, which is welfare? Because you've talked about cutting welfare. So it's a very significant cut. And again, I'm not saying this because I don't think it should happen. If anybody's followed me for the last 25 years, I've been adamant that we got to stop spending so much money. Like we're spending so much, we can't sustain it. And there is waste that can be cut, but we can't do it all at once. We can't expect tariffs to fix it. But it does have to happen. And I think that's one of the things we have to understand is long term, we can't run the deficits, the budget deficit and the trade deficits we're running today. And President Trump that's, that's his, you know, what he won on. He said he's going to fix the economy, but the things that need fixed are not a 1 year or 2 year or even 4 year solution. We have to reset our labor force. We have to train people into jobs that are going to be there 10 years from now. We have to figure out ways to rein in the cost of education. By the way, I put this out on my LinkedIn and got a firestorm of people disagreeing. We need to cut the Department of Education. The Department of Education does not fund K through 12 like you would think it does. The Department of Education basically subsidizes student loans, which then subsidizes the ridiculous university complex. The reason tuition is skyrocketing is because we took student loans away from private banks and said the government was going to subsidize everything. When you make things easy to pay for, guess what happens to costs? They go up. Healthcare, nobody's talking about Medicare and the deficits we're running there. I think an average American spends 20 to 22% of their income on healthcare, and that's with Obamacare. And yet, our life expectancy is about 4 to 5 years lower than other countries. So we spend more on healthcare and we get less out of it. I don't know that the Doge is talking about taking on the healthcare complex. Definitely cutting the Department of Education would be a shot against the university complex. Taking it across, to defense, there's a lot of institutions that need to be cut and to reset. So if they were to accomplish $500 billion of cuts in 1 year, that's going to hit the economy, but that's not a bad thing from that. So it looks like one more question came. Well, it wasn't a question. It just said Musk was not elected by anyone. I agree, but neither are all the people who are in the ears of the president. From, every president has people in their ears, and everything Elon Musk does and suggests does not become law. That has to be voted on by Congress. It cannot be executive ordered. Although President Trump can certainly executive order making everybody come back to work if you're a federal government employee. And if you don't like it, they can quit. That's perfectly legal. And you do not have to be elected to do that, because if the president chooses to have an advisor who was not elected, that's his right. And he can do that. And as long as it's constitutionally allowed and doesn't violate the law, he can take advice from anybody who wasn't elected. And that's what makes our country beautiful. And hopefully, regardless of who you voted for, regardless of where you lean politically, I hope you understand that at the end, I love America, and I think we're going to come out of this no matter what. It's not going to be the greatest 4 years of our country's history. It's not going to be the worst 4 years of our history. We're going to have a lot of trials along the way. And if they get too bad and too dicey and we feel a lot of angst, we're going to do another SCM University. We're going to continue posting on social media, so follow us along there. I'm going to post every Monday on our blog, so follow me along there. And we're going to try to be that ballast for you to ignore the noise and focus on what's important. So thank you for joining us. We're so appreciative of your time, and stay tuned for more.